Hi everyone, it's Paul here. Hopefully everyone who wants to be is on. So let's get started with today's editing session. Before we go into Capture One, just a reminder to those people that are running Capture One already, make sure you've updated to 20.0.4. That was released the end of last week. There's a few bug fixes in there as well as camera profiles. So given that it's the second or third release officially since Capture 120, it's worth just keeping up to date because they get rid of all of the little niggles and hiccups that happen with all new software. Also, final reminder for those of you that have got Sony and Fuji cameras, make sure that you use that discount code, that Spring25 discount code by the end of today, Central European time. That gets you 25% off. If you don't, then tomorrow, miraculously, everything goes back up to full price. However, at the end of this session, there might be a bit of good news for those people that want to get a copy of Capture One, and I'll tell you about that a bit later. So, let's go into today's Hi guys, sorry, I think you all lost the sound. We're back now, so thanks Ian for yelling that out. I don't know what happened there. This tree unfortunately is now very, very famous, even more famous than it was more than a couple of weeks ago. This is one of the most photographed trees in the world. It's in New Zealand, it's in a place called Wanaka, and a week or two ago one or many individuals decided it was fitting to take one of its branches off. Or one or two, in fact, looking at what was left on the beach. So unfortunately, this rather picturesque tree will never look the same again. However, this one was captured by ST before that happened. Looks around about sunset. Azida, you've just said no sound as well. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me now. It's very difficult to say yell if you can't because I can't hear you. But yes, okay, right, yes, you can hear me. Cool. So this around about sunset time, it's very difficult for white balance around sunset, and I'll show you that in a second with another picture for auto white balance. But let's go into our first stop, which is our lens correction. And this is a good example where here I can show you the difference with different lens correction profiles. So obviously if you've got the right lens profile loaded into Capture One, so Capture One has loads and loads of lenses listed, all of a sudden your profile corrections for all of things like chromatic aberration and distortion and sharpness and so on are done automatically by Phase One and their experts in Copenhagen that analyze these lenses and look for imperfections and fix them. However, not all lenses in the world are covered by this. So there's two functions that Phase One give you for lenses that aren't covered by this profiling. One is what they call generic. So generic is basically Phase One and Capture One saying, we don't know exactly what lens was used to take this picture. We haven't got a clue, so we're just going to use a generic lens profile, and then you can make your adjustments as you see fit. So you can do that in terms of distortion. So we can warp it as if it was a fisheye. You can do it in terms of sharpness fall off. You can do it in terms of light fall off. So if the lens heavily vignettes, we can lighten the corners. And you can do some general defringing where the software picks everything up. Slightly better is this concept called a manufacturer profile. So if we load in a different image, and let me give you an example. Let's load in this one, which will appear later. So this one says manufacturer profile at the top. What that means is this camera has embedded some information inside the raw file. And it's embedded information about the camera, the sensor, the lens, and so on, which Capture One can pick up on. So effectively, we don't need to load in a separate profile down here. If we've got the right profile, we may as well load it in, because it's going to do some stuff automatically for us. But if it says manufacturer profile and you load in an image, it means that Capture One is now using the raw data that the manufacturer embedded into that picture to correct the image. On this case here, we don't have that option. We've got a generic profile loaded in, which means actually Capture One saying, I don't know what lens this was, the camera didn't tell me, and you're going to have to make some corrections for yourself. Don't be tempted to find one that's similar. I see lots of people doing this, so just to make the example, I'm going to be very unfair and zoom into a stupid amount, so let's go to 200%. And we see this line, this ridge line here, there's a slight bit of purple fringing on the edge there. So we know from our information this was shot with a Nikon 80-200 2.8. Okay, so let's look at our Nikon lenses. Cool, and there's no 80-200. But what there is one that's close, I guess. 70-200 can't be too bad, can it? So let's click on that one. Now in our 70-200, let's do all the tick boxes. Let's turn on some chromatic aberration. Oh, look what's happened. That purple line has now got dramatically brighter and more ugly. So the reason is every lens, literally every single lens in the world is different. Even lenses that are the same in terms of their specification. Throughout a manufacturing run, you can get slight changes, slight imperfections. So don't be tempted to try and find a lens that's close enough. If the lens isn't listed, either use the manufacturer profile if it's loaded in, or stick to generic and do the distortion stuff yourself, do the sharpness stuff yourself. Next to chromatic aberration, if the lens has got any of these issues, there's a little 3 dots which lots of people don't touch. If you click on it, it'll automatically do default, and that's the same. If you load it in a lens profile, it will also use the default chromatic aberration settings. But Capture One actually has a really cool feature, which is analyze. And what analyzing does, you see how that's just disappeared completely. So even if I'd loaded in the correct lens profile, there is a chance that my particular copy of that particular lens isn't exactly the same as the one that the clever people back in the lab at Capture One loaded in the lens to put the profile together had. So with all those differences, if you do have any imperfections in the image, or you're using a generic profile, one quick tip: chromatic aberration, click on the 3 little dots, click on analyze. It's then created the profile specific to this image, specific to this camera, this exact lens, and this exact image, where it's analyzed and it's fixed any of those aberrations. So we can see there that purple line's gone. Perfect. We could do a bit of sharpness fall off, because I know that on this lens there's a little bit of softness at the edges. Not too much, we don't want to overdo it. There's not much distortion, it was shot at 170mm, so to me, we're pretty good. Okay. The lens is relatively, the image is relatively flat. Part of the reason for that, I know this lake, there's an awful lot of moisture on the lake. You're shooting at quite a long distance, especially at sunset, so you've got this light coming in from the left-hand side. It's lighting up moisture in the air, and the tree loses a little bit of definition against the background. So, firstly, let's correct our white balance. Typically, people like using auto white balance, right? Because auto white balance does everything for us. Well, in here, and this is one, we'll talk about this a bit later as well, auto white balance at sunset can cause some problems, because even the things that were white aren't white at sunset, because you've got that golden color. You've either got the sort of pinky or yellowy or orangey color. So what will happen if I click on this little dropper here and say, well, here we go, snow is white, right? I mean, it's snow. Click. Ooh, it's gone all green. And the reason is because it didn't know that while the snow is white, at sunset, that snow is bouncing off some slight sort of reddy, orangey tones and so on. Likewise, so this tree, well, if I click on the tree, it looks pretty dark. So is it on the black to white scale? Yeah, maybe, but actually no, because obviously tree bark isn't black, it's brown. So we're trying to find in here somewhere that should be white and is white in this light. And at sunset and sunrise, that's really, really difficult, because even the objects that are on the grayscale tone start to pick up the color of the sky. What we can use, however, and is a bit of a trick, if ever you're shooting water with reflections and the water is in the shade, so as long as the water's in the shade and not reflecting the actual sunlight, use the dropper and click on the water. and it will correct roughly for what the correct tone should be. So we've still got this slightly pinky color up here in the mountains where the sun was coming through. These clouds look about right, but the water's now correctly the right color. Okay. Of course, if we didn't want to use the auto thing, or we think that's gone a little bit too wrong, we can always do our manual adjustment here with our Kelvin. So remember, Kelvin goes from cool to warm, so from daylight through to sunset and evening, and then tint corrects for any filter issues, so color cast from green up to pink. Let's just leave that roughly there. That looks pretty good. Okay, so next up, let's try and separate the tree from the background. Now, there is a bit of an obvious one here, which is our clarity slider. So clarity makes things pop, great. But it's also made everything look really, really harsh in this background. And actually, I quite liked the fact that the background was a bit more washed out than other things. So let's just turn that clarity off. That looks quite nice, and it's in the bokeh, it's out of focus in the image. Yeah, it's a bit too strong. And we're starting to pick up some haloing on the edges of the mountain. So let's not do it all with clarity. Instead, on one of the sessions we did earlier, we talked about things like Luma Masks. So let's draw a really, really, really rough mask. New layer. And I'm going to call this tree. Let's turn our mask on so you can see it. And I'm at 100 and 100. So 100 opacity, 100% flow. Soft mask, but we'll come back to that in a second. And I'm just drawing. I'm drawing roughly where the tree branches are. And these birds, let's get all that there. Not too worried about the edges because they're picking up light anyway. Once you see what we're going to do, that'll make sense. Okay, so there's our branches. Great. Now, I can darken these, of course. So let's go to our exposure and, ooh, okay, we don't want to do that. I just want to darken the branches. So we've got this Luma range. Now, actually, there's another thing that I could do. I could use shadows in here or black. So let's pull down our shadows. Well, that's a problem because actually all of this background is a shadow as well, as far as the histogram is concerned. Next thing, blacks. Let's pull that down. Well, actually, even some of that is also in the black area. So what happens if I use a Luma range instead? So let's turn on the mask. And remember, this replicates my histogram. So I want everything with no fall off that's in the darkest part of the image. And I'm going to pull this slider all the way back until I start isolating just the branches of the tree. There. Now I have a bit of an issue because, as you can see, this Luma range is pretty accurate, but it's left out some of this tree here, and the trunk here, it's because it's up here in the middle of the histogram. So if I were to pull it so I get the trunk, I also get this background. I could try with fall off. Yeah, still going to be an issue with the background. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create two masks. So the first one is this one, tree, apply. And I'm going to create a new mask called, strangely, trunk. And with this mask, we're going to draw in our tree trunk. Same thing applies, Luma range, display mask. And with this one, we knew that actually it needed to start a little bit earlier, sort of maybe there. Okay. That's good. Now, if I use our exposure tool now to pull that trunk down, now we get it nice and dark. And we can use our exposure tool to pull our tree down. We get that dark as well. There's a little bit of an overlap, and the overlap comes from the fact that here is our tree, which goes down to here. And here is our trunk, which goes up to here. So what we're going to use is our eraser tool, this one here, at 50% opacity, and just feather this top part in. So effectively I'm blending the mask from the trunk up to the mask that is the tree. So this bit in the middle is going to get a bit of both masks. And if I turn our mask off, so without, tree's a little bit lost into the background. With, we've now got our tree identified. And actually, if we wanted that trunk a little bit darker still, we could just pull our exposure down a little bit more there too. And remember, it's only affecting not just the area that I painted, but also only this range of the histogram on the area that I painted. Hi Pablo from Spain, cool. Okay, so that's our tree separated quite nicely. It's now a lot more contrasty. Of course, we've got an overall contrast that we can apply in this image, and we've always done it in previous ones through the contrast tool and the high dynamic range. We can also use the levels tool. And I want to show you something here which is a bit of a gotcha for some people. So levels, a lot of people are familiar with levels. The levels tool basically maps, let's just pull this here so we can talk it through. It maps effectively our histogram here. And it says, here are my levels from 0 to 255. Here is the picture from 0 to 255, and I can change this mapping. So if I go to our background layer, I can say, well, actually in the picture, I've got a lot of stuff here that's not in range of the histogram. So actually in the picture, the stuff that I want to be really bright isn't at 255, it's actually all the way down here. So I'm going to pull this line down. And what that's doing to the image is it's saying, right, the things that were almost bright, make them really bright. So this is our output at the top, as it's known. This is our input at the bottom. So I'm saying anything that was almost bright, not quite at the very high end, I want you to stretch that and pull it to be completely bright, to 255. And anything that's dark, actually anything that was really dark, I want you to make it really, really dark by stretching that bottom bit. So imagine these lines here are my new histogram, and it's stretched them up to this full histogram from 0 to 255. So levels tool is really, really powerful. If I so to temporarily see a difference, if I hold down the Option key and click on this little undo button and hold down the mouse, it will show me before. Let go of the mouse, that's after. So before, a little bit flat. After, a bit more punchy. Great. But I want to show you quickly a little gotcha that a lot of people fall foul of, which is the auto levels function. So there are two modes of auto levels. The first is under preferences, the default, which is channel mode RGB. So what that says is look at this entire histogram, just like I did on the screen just now, and look at the entire histogram and try and level it up. So let's get everything in this picture that was dark and everything in this picture that was light, and let's stretch them out. Great. But there's a separate version, or a secondary version, which is called red, green and blue channels independently. And I could actually do this manually. So let's change this auto mode to red, green and blue channels so you can see the difference. So manually, I've got the RGB thing here on my levels tool, but I can actually go into the reds, the greens and the blues independently and set our levels. Now, just to show you the difference, let me just switch back to RGB quickly. So I can still do this independently on RGB mode, but I've got this auto button. So let's do auto adjust, shall we? Okay, it's done similar to what I did. It's pulled in the bottom top half, and it's pulled in the bottom left half here. So we've got our darks darker and our lights lighter. Great. Overall in the image, okay. But let's look at the red, green and blue channels. So it's mapped all of those across to the same histogram. Let's undo that. I'm going to switch to red, green and blue mode. Now in some pictures this does a good thing. So what happens is a lot of people learn about this, they leave this on channel mode red, green and blue, and then they forget about it. Let's auto level this now. Whoa. Now what it's done is, quite correctly, it has corrected the levels in the red channel differently to the levels in the blue channel and differently to the level in the green channel. And what it's done is for each channel, it's made the lightest part of the image really light, the darkest part of the image really dark in the reds. Now look at these sliders, these are changing dramatically. So it's pulling more of the green up, it's pulling more of even more of the blue up. So the blue, it's only got to be about 60% in brightness, and all of a sudden it's made it the brightest part of the image. Whereas on the red, at about 80% of the brightness, it's made it the brightest part of the image. So by having it on this separated format as auto, we end up with an undesired effect. Let's call it that and be polite. If I switch back to RGB and do another auto, I'm now stuck with where I was to begin with, because it's doing it on the top of what this channel or the separate channel version was. So what I've got to do is I've got to undo all of our layers work, and either opt for RGB and click auto, or do it manually just like I did before. Now on some images the separate RGB mode works great. If the image has got equal amounts of red, green and blue, but maybe one of them is slightly out in terms of white balance, what it can do is it can correct for that, and you almost get a color correction factor as a result of splitting out the levels. While it's great, a lot of people end up with a result that they weren't expecting, so just keep an eye on that preference. Channel mode, RGB. If it's red, green and blue channels, don't be surprised if you get a weird effect when you hit the levels, and if you do, just switch back to RGB or do it manually. Okay, up here we could, if we wanted to, we could put in a couple of quick gradients. Let's put in a new one here, and this is nothing more than just pulling in the attention of the viewer up towards that tree. So let's do that one there, and I'm going to create a new one for the sky. I should have named these really, but I'm being a little bit lazy. And we'll pull our highlights down, but only in the sky. I don't want to pull the highlights down here because we want that separation with the tree. And we'll pull our white levels down there. Cool. So let's create a clone of that variant so we can see before and after. Now again, with all of these changes and all those adjustments, if we didn't like one particular adjustment, we can always use our, let's just move on to this one, we can move our opacity on the layer. So if I didn't like how much the foreground was darkened, well, I can just pull this opacity down. If I didn't like how dark the trunk was, I can pull that opacity down, and we can get the result that we want. But there we go, one tree. Cool. Let's go on to a recovery one. So this image is from Paul. Remember what I just talked about, generic profile versus manufacturer. So this was taken with a Panasonic Lumix G with this lens. What Capture One has said is actually we've got all the information we need. It's stored within the file. So I'm going to stick with that. Because of that, it doesn't let us do any sharpness correction or light fall off. But we can still play with distortion, and we can also do our chromatic aberration analyze for this particular image, and it's now created a unique profile for this image for that shot. 3.5, it's very, very unlikely to have any diffraction. So what are we going to look at on this image? Well, there's a couple of things. The first is, I don't know about you, but to me, the angle is a little bit uncomfortable, and the reason is this line here isn't quite straight. This line is a little bit more straight, so some of that is because we're looking down on the image. So remember that you get the converging and diverging effect. And from a lightness and exposure point of view, this is a really tricky place to shoot because you've got this really big dark area of the cave up here on the left, and then you've got this really bright overexposed area outside. To a lot of people, this would actually make a lot of sense to try a bracketed exposure, so effectively a in-camera HDR or processed HDR. So we expose one image for the highlights and one image for the shadows. That would have made sense, but at this particular point we've only got the one raw, so let's see what we can do with it. First thing, let's pull up our exposure warning to see how bad the overexposure is, and actually it's not too bad. So we've got a few little red areas down here. Let's turn our warning off and pull down our exposure just to see, are we losing any detail? No, it's got all the detail. So the raw file actually had, and let's put the warning back on, look, it's gone. So the raw file has a lot of dynamic range in it. It's only when we get up to about one stop underexposed that we start to blow out. And then when we get back up to full, then we've got quite a few hot spots. But down here at about 1.5 stops underexposed, this is quite clear. Nothing really wrong with the highlights there. All good. Okay, so let's look at our shadows. So we know that we're about 1.5 stops over on our highlights. What about our shadows? Well, this area here is okay, but even the histogram up here is telling us, look at that line. We've got no data up here apart from a spike, and then you've got all this shadow work. So let's pull our histogram up until we can see all the detail in the shadows. So it's about 3 stops up. Now, looking at the shape of this image, actually, a graduated filter might have helped a little bit because it's not just the outside that's the issue. It's also the difference in light between up here on the right and down here on the left. Balancing them in camera might have helped a little bit. We can correct for this, but this is going to be a lot in the shadows. So if I pull this up so I can see this properly in detail, look at all this noise that's coming out of the shadows. And this is the thing, we can correct for certain amounts of shadow, or underexposure and overexposure, but at the point that we start getting noise in the image, and these are artifacts that are coming from the fact that Capture One is now stretching data that wasn't really there. The camera didn't really see all of this stuff, so it's trying to make some stuff up. Let's go and pull our noise reduction up a touch, keep our detail information there. Don't actually need any single pixels. It was a quick shot with no hot pixels. It's not great, and it's just because it was purely shot in the shadows. So let's correct this first before we start doing any changes in terms of angles and straightening and so on, because it's much easier to do when we're working on an image that's correctly exposed, so we can see everything. So let's pull our exposure back down. So we know that we're about 3 stops under on this part of the shadow and about 1.5 stops over on this part of the highlights. Well, we've got our high dynamic range tool, so let's start with that. Let's pull our highlights down, and to do this, let's just focus on the area that we're worried about, which is out here. And this is a particular hotspot here, so that was our bit that was overexposed. Let's pull our highlights down by quite a long way. Let's see how far we can push it. And the white, so remember, highlights is the top range of the image, about the top third, maybe top quarter. The whites is between 5 and 10% of the very, very brightest parts of the image. Let's pull these down all the way, and our highlights down quite a bit. So already, if I hold down the Option key again and the undo button, so let's go before and after, much better. It's a natural set of pixels in there. We haven't done anything overly fake or anything like that. This was the genuine content and data that the camera saw. It's just it wasn't captured in the flat file as one image. So all of this is the massive dynamic range that the camera is actually capable of capturing within the camera's histogram, but when we view it as a single image on screen and when it's metered for a single shot on the camera, you don't see that, but we can pull it back. So what if we do the same in our shadows and our blacks? So let's pull up the shadows, and for this I want to zoom out so I can see what's happening over here and down here. So just the shadows all together. It's done a pretty good job. We've not got too much noise. We've got a little bit of a softness there, and that's some of the focusing stuff. We're getting a little bit of an issue here with some of our lines, and that just comes from a byproduct of doing some of the HDR stuff. Especially as well where it's been a bit sharpened. Let's pull our details back down here. And our sharpening down. Okay. So it's done a pretty good job here. It hasn't really picked up here enough, and that's because this was the darkest part of the image. So let's pull up the blacks here, the darkest part of the shot. Okay. It's not too bad. I don't want to pull these up too much because remember we had all that noise in there. So if I pull it up too much, ooh, this is not nice. But I can get away with probably there. And it does make sense that it's a shadow. It's a cave. This makes perfect sense. So what we also don't want to do, and let's go to the extreme. This doesn't make sense. You were in a cave. So let's make it look like it was in a cave. Let's just pull that down there. Okay, so I'm going to leave this the very darkest area as a little bit dark. I'm going to pull our shadows down just a touch there. Okay, let's create a clone of this variant and reset those so I can see the before and after. So even before we've done much, just by using those high dynamic range sliders, we've gone from this to this. I can see all this detail in here. Actually, I think it's a little bit over still, so we can pull down our highlights, the recovery there, and the white recovery, because I still want to see some contrast in there. I'm also going to pull down the shadows a touch and the blacks just to keep it a bit more natural. Okay, before we then go on to the final correction, I'm going to change our white balance. So again, difficult on this one because if I were to choose an area that should be grey, I don't actually know which bit should be, because this cave wall here looks like it's got some, whether it's lime or something running down the wall, it makes it slightly green. This is obviously sandstone here, it's going to be very cold. This is more of a coppery sort of thing on the top. Nope. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it manually. In fact, that's not bad actually. A bit of grey there. However, let's do this manually. So we're going to do it by eye. One of the tips that we talk about quite a lot on workshop stuff is take a picture with your camera phone when you see an image, because generally the camera phone is able to capture what you saw pretty accurately because it's processing the image at the point that it takes it. It doesn't mean the image is better, because actually some of that processing actually can be a negative. However, it's a good reminder of what it looked like and what it felt like in terms of color temperature at the time. When you get back to your desk and you start editing, use that as a way of getting back to what you saw, rather than trying to guess what it was. So let's warm this up a little bit, because it does. This should be sandstone here. These cave walls should be a little bit warmer. Yes, David, I'm going to put you up on the screen. Got to keep it natural. Yes, this is the biggest thing with all of this is there is no point in taking a picture with a camera that's designed to record exactly what you saw and then obliterating it into something that you didn't see. So let's keep it natural. Let's keep it looking like it was, which is a cave. So it should be dark. It should be that warm color of the sandstone. It shouldn't look like a cartoon. So a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit more tint. Okay, so to me that looks okay. I'm actually tempted to pull a little bit of a vignette in, just again because I know I've got some noise down here and I want to distract the viewer from that noise. So let's use our vignette tool just to pull that in there, and again that also pulls more focus into here. So we've still got the detail in this cave area here, we've still got the detail up here, but we're pulling the viewer's attention back into this structure in the middle. Which then leads me on to the final bit, which is this structure in the middle. It is not straight, and it's not straight for two reasons. One, it's leaning a little bit to the left, so the camera wasn't quite level. To say it's virtually impossible to get a camera 100% level in all situations is true. Some of the cameras have now got spirit levels and so on inside them, but the amount of calibration they need all the time, sometimes they get a little bit out. You're better off getting it as close as you can in the camera, if not perfect, and then we can fix it later on. Now, if I use the straighten tool, so the straighten tool can be used not just for horizontal lines, we can also use it for vertical lines. So let's use our straighten tool, and we know that this line here should be straight because it's a wall. Cool, but it's not, because this side isn't straight. So what's happening? Did they build the building wonky, or actually it's something else going on, which is this needs some keystoning. So keystoning is, and we talked about this with the New York shot the other day, and this is to correct for perspective as we look at something. So as we look down on objects, or as we look up on objects, or as they go off to the right or left in the distance, what's called the keystone of that object changes. It either diverges or converges to our eyes. So the keystone tool allows me to correct for that. So we get these 4 little points on the vertical tool. So that's this tool up here. And let's go in, and I'm going to place 1 point on this straight wall here. I'm going to move down here and place the other point on this part of the wall here, not this part, because this part comes out wider. We've used the same line of wall. And let's use this part of the wall here. And finally, that same part of the wall there, and let's apply. So what that's now done is it has stretched and changed and warped. You can see this trapezoid shape here on the outside of the image. So it's corrected for our keystoning, and it's made this straight, level, even, and adjusted. We could, in fact, probably straighten the image a little bit more now. So I can do it with this tool here. Yep. If I didn't want to, if I go back to our lens tab on our, what do I talk about? Under the rotation and flip area, we've got an angle here. So it's guessed it at 0.5 degrees. I think it's slightly less than that. It's about 0.4. That's about right. And I've got my final crop tool. I can move this around, or I can make it bigger if I want to. So remember, we're going to lose some of the image because of those tools, because it's got to stretch the image out to make it correct. So let's put this back where it was. There. So we go from this image to this image in literally a few sliders. So what have we changed? We've changed our white balance. We've recovered the highlights, recovered the shadows, recovered the whites, recovered the blacks. That's 5 sliders. Haven't done anything with levels. We haven't even touched the clarity function. All we've done is added a vignette, and then we've corrected the perspective with the keystone tool. So 5 sliders, keystone tool. And we go from this to this. This is, I'm sure, what the human eye saw, but unfortunately the camera can only meter for one thing at a time, which is whether it's adjusting for the highlights, the shadows, or the midtones. And in this particular image, it needed to focus on the midtones for that exposure and then let us pull out the shadows and the highlights in the final version. So there's our raw, and there's our finished version, which looks natural. Cool. Let's go on to one by Peter. Okay. So out in the mountains somewhere. Peter, if you're on, I don't know where this is, but if you let me know, then we can yell it out. So we've got a town here in the distance, quite a lot in the shadows. We've got some nice, happy little clouds on top of the mountains. We've got a little bit of overexposure on our sun. Let's turn the exposure warning on. Yeah, and I don't think this part of the exposure is going to be recoverable. So let's prove that. If I pull our exposure down, yeah, you see. So at the point that I get rid of this overexposed area, there's no detail left in here. So if we look at, for instance, this cloud here, I can tell that we've still got the dynamic range here, because even though at this point here, this is all overexposed and I've got no detail, at the point that I can get rid of the red, I still have detail up here. In this area here, at the point that the red disappears, my exposure warning, it's solid white, there's no detail. It doesn't matter how far down I push it, look, the camera just didn't record anything there because it was blown out. So we're gonna have to deal with that. Well, I say deal with it, we're gonna accept that. So in this shot, the part that was pointing directly into the sun was overexposed. Well, yeah, that makes sense. So we've got a couple of things with this shot. The first is, let me reset back to the original white balance. It's green, and I don't mean the grass. The image itself is green, and some of that is because probably when the camera was doing its auto white balance measurements, this is, again, the sun is low, so it's probably at sunset, if not at sunrise. That's giving us a little bit of a warm tone. The camera's tried to correct for that. It's probably corrected some of the pinks in the sky as well. So it's made everything a little bit green. If I go to, let's go daylight, it's going to make everything cooler. If I go to cloudy, it's going to make everything a bit warmer. But none of these are going to work for me because I want it to feel a little bit pink, a little bit warm up in the sky, but keep the greens down here in the field. So here's our problem. Again, going back to that white balance thing, and just as a reminder, lens profile. So this is loaded in a lens profile. Great. F8, we shouldn't have much diffraction. Let's put it on anyway. I'm not too worried about sharpness in this one. I've had a look inside and there's no fringing, so we're good. Let's choose our area of white balance. So let's say, well, these concrete buildings, they're painted white, right? Okay. So that's grayed up here. Well, it's not actually grey up here. It's not got it quite right. Let's choose another bit of white. Yeah, okay. So it's warming up the sky nicely, but then it's making all the grass brown. That doesn't make sense. So, and this is where there's the problem. You're taking a white balance reading from a period or an area of the image which should be white, but in this light would not have been white. So if you try and tell Capture One that this is on a grey scale or between black and white with no color information, this, which is what you're looking for the white balance tool, this area here would not have actually been completely grayscale. It wouldn't have been white or grey. It would have had some color on it because it's reflecting it from the sun. So I can't use the auto tool. Let's use our manual tools. So first off, let's pull down the exposure in the sky. That's a bit better. That looks a bit more like a sunrisey sort of color. That's quite nice. Let's go to there. That's great. But I've got my exposure issue. And of course, I've also made all of this brown. So as I pull the exposure up, I've lost the vivid green. So we're going to do similar to what I did the other day, which is we're going to create a split in this image using the Luma range from the sky and the ground. So remember these numbers. It was about 9,500 and it was about, let's say 13. That looks about right for the sky. I'm just going to reset our white balance and I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this one sky. And I could be lazy and use the gradient tool, or I can just paint. Let's make the brush a little bit bigger. Go into 100%. Paint over the sky. Lovely. All filled in, looks great. Now, it used to be that we'd use our advanced mask tool, and we'll cover that in a later session to try and get all these trees and everything perfect, because we can get a line around all these trees. But with the Luma range, I'm finding more and more now in Capture One, we don't need to do that because a lot of it is just covered by how bright the area was. So let's get to the whole image. Let's go to Luma range. And instantly we can see that it's taken out this brightest part. And the reason is because of this little notch here in our Luma range histogram. So I'm going to fill that in and say, no, anything that was bright. I want you to make sure you've captured everything that was bright. Let's zoom in to here, because this is going to help us with our Luma range. And everything that was bright, I want to be red in the mask. And now I'm going to pull up the lower part of the Luma range. So remember, this is telling us which part of the histogram within this painted area do we actually want to capture with this mask. So by pulling this part up, it's saying, right, start ignoring all the darker areas, and you can see the mask creeping up the mountainside. And we want it so that we're not seeing any of the trees masked anymore. Good. Now what about this mountain here? And the issue is obviously because this was slightly bright because it was covered by the sun, but we've got this really hard line down here. So if we make any changes, you're going to see this hard line. That's what this fall off is for. So if we watch down here on this mountain, this is with no fall off, hard line. So what it's saying is this pixel is within my range, this pixel is not. So draw the line there. This bottom part of the slider allows me to soften that transition. So just like a gradient mask. And you can see as I'm pulling it, it's pulling it down the mountain nice and softly. Okay, so now I have an area that was masked. So you saw how roughly I painted, but by using that Luma mask, I've got an area that was masked, really, really detailed, really intricate, and that now only affects the sky. So there's my sky mask. Wonderful. Let's turn the mask off. And let's now put in those values. So remember, we were at 9,500 and we're at about 13. Now we've got our sky corrected. Great. And also up here, of course, we can pull our exposure down a little bit. Now I don't want to pull it down too much because that's going to overemphasize the fact that this is a little bit overexposed. But what I'm going to do is pull it down a touch and pull our highlights down a little bit there. Okay. Back to our background. Well, we do want it to be nice and green, but we also want to pull up our shadows. We don't want to affect the sky or anything like that. So we're going to pull up our exposure overall and then pull up our shadows, possibly the black area. So again, the bottom 10%-ish of the histogram, there's quite a lot of data in this bottom 10% in this picture. So we've got to be careful with it, but that's what the blacks is affecting here. So probably to there with shadows. And now we've got to make this a little bit warmer, and then we've got to correct for this green tint on the buildings. So let's go a little bit warmer there and correct a bit for that tint there. Okay. Overall, this is looking a bit better. The white areas of the concrete up here are looking more natural, they're looking more correct, they're looking more white rather than green. And this area here is looking okay. It's a little bit too soft. It's not quite that rich, vivid green that we had before. So final stop. Here we're going to add a new layer with my nice rough brush, and we're just going to paint in these areas here that I really want to pick up the green in. I'm not too worried about that mountain in the distance. Happy to let that go into the mist. And with our color tab up here, so we were on our exposure tab before, this up here is our color tab, and we've got our color editor. So in here, we can do it manually with the little green chooser, or I can click on this picker and say this area of greens and yellows. In this case, it's the yellow section. I'm going to use my mouse to move to the right, which makes the hue more green, and move up with my mouse to saturate it a bit. Good. And then I could choose manually the greens here, make them a little less light, a little more to it. So this is going to change the hue from a yellowy color to a greeny color. This is way over the top, obviously. So let's pull it up to there, pull our saturation down a touch, and our lightness down there. Cool. So without and with. So we just saturated the greens a little bit and made them a little bit darker. If we don't like how much it's done, easy. Remember, you've got the opacity on that layer, and we can make it slightly less impactful. Okay, so let's create a clone of that variant and reset it. So there's our raw, and there's our image. If we didn't like any of these sections up here, let's just rename this one grass. So if we don't like the sky in this one, of course we can remove it, or we can change our opacity of how much of an effect we want on that sky from what we did. On the grass, we can make it greener and darker, or we can make it completely less green and less vivid, completely up to you. But what we have done is corrected for this green green cast in the image with the white balance. We've managed to get some of the detail in this sky back. We've managed to keep all the green in the grass down there. Okay, let's go on to our last image, which is a great big slab of ice from Iceland. So this is Mark's shot. It's loaded in a manufacturer profile. A lot of the Sony cameras will do this. So this was a Sony A7R2, and it's loaded in some helpful information about the shot and the lens. Just for fun, let's just reiterate what we did before. Let's analyze the chromatic aberration and make sure that it's correct for this exact image. Okay, so it's now created a profile specifically for this image. So that is a profile that's analyzed the chromatic aberration on this lens, on that sensor, for that camera, on this particular image in this particular light. So it's a lot more accurate than the generic version. F20, we might have a bit of diffraction going on in there. I don't think we've got much purple fringing, actually. It did pretty well out here, because actually the purple in there is actually in the sky. So we've got some lovely colours up here in the sky. We've got some horrible dusty areas up here, which we'll cover very quickly. And Mark's going to learn to clean his lens and filters a lot more often. So again, I showed you that trick the other day in terms of finding dust spots. So my dust finder, to make it easier, so we'll create a new filled layer. On that layer, so we know that everything is affected, on that layer I'm going to pull our clarity all the way up, our structure all the way up, our contrast up, and our exposure down a little bit. So without that layer, I would have maybe missed these two. With that layer, I can see them. So I go back to my background layer and I choose my dust spot tool. And let's get rid of some of these. There's one there. There's a good one there. Don't worry about these squiggly bits. That's because I've put too much structure on, but it's helping me see these dust spots really, really easy. There's a tiny one there. There's a one there. Let's see if it can get that one. Yeah, it's done a pretty good job. No, actually, I don't like that one. Let's get rid of that one. I don't like what it's done there, so we can do that one differently. Okay, so there is a difference between dust spots like this, and like this, and like this, and squiggles, which are dirt and debris and hairs and so on the lens or on the filter. So for these, instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use a heal layer. And I'm going to do it underneath this layer again. So with our heal layer, we get a brush, and I'm going to choose my brush size to about there. Opacity 100, flow 100, and I want the hardness as soft as it can be. And I choose my origin, and I paint. And it's going to do some clever stuff and get rid of it. And as long as I'm keeping the same, what's called vector, so in other words, my source position is the same as my destination position for every single area, I can use the same healing brush for lots of areas in the shot. If the vector needs to change, then I might need to choose a different layer and choose a different source, but this one's not doing bad. I might come back to that one later. I'll ignore it for now just for speed, but I'll come back to it later. So I'm going to create a new heal layer, and this is one where we can say this is heal top right to bottom left. So I know the vector that's in there. Heal right, oops, to left. And as the name implies, source there on the right, destination on the left. And let's put that under there so I can see. Cool, and this one's probably a right to left. Yeah, this one's a right to left for sure. Yeah, this one's a right to left. Good. This one's just a dust spot, so we'll go back to our background and put a dust spot on there. Good. And this one we're going to try right to left, see if we can get away with it. No, not quite. So unfortunately, new heel layer. So this is going to be heel bottom right to top left. Just be careful with the number of layers that you use in Capture One. I think from memory the limit's maybe 16. I can't remember exactly. David might interrupt and correct that if I've got it wrong. But overall, we've got most of those heels done. I'm going to turn off, normally I would call this Dust Finder or just Dust and Scratches Finder. I'm going to turn that off. So now I've got rid of all of those dust and spots and scratches and horrible stuff. Great. Let's go back to our background layer. And on our background layer, the white balance in this is pretty nice. Remember, it's ice, it's Iceland, it's a block of ice. Let's just make sure our horizon is level. So one way of doing that is we load in a guide. So let's add a horizontal guide, this red line. And actually it's not quite level. So let's use our straighten tool and draw along there, up to there, almost. Okay, this guide, we can either leave it up there and pull it down later, or we can just get rid of it completely. I want to darken this a little bit. I think this has had a filter put on it, a graduated filter already, but let's darken the sky a little bit more because we want the focus to be on this ice block. We don't want the focus to be out here. This sky is lovely, but the subject is this block of ice. So, in part, what I'd also do maybe is pull this in on the third line a little bit more, just compositionally. And also, I love this water down here. This sky is great, but this sky up here is a little bit boring. So even though I put some effort into removing dust spots, now I've done that, I want to pull this in here. So that feels like a better crop in my head. And let's pull in our new gradient filter. So new empty layer, and we're going to call this one sky. Pull down a gradient, very soft gradient. I'm not going to do anything clever in terms of trying to, pull this this fall off up. We're just going to leave it nice and soft fall off. Okay. And with this, we're going to pull down. We've got two choices. We can pull down our exposure. That's also going to make this cloud a little bit murky as well. Or we pull down the highlights, which isn't going to affect that cloud because it was already in the darker part of the image, or darker part of the histogram. And we just pull down the highlights there. So all that's done is it's just softened off some of the bright area up here. And up here, we've got this slight green tint going on in the sky. So I'm just going to correct for that by a little bit more of a pink tint. Oop, not too much. Just up to about there. Good. Okay, ice. One word for ice, clarity. So this ice block is nice and sharp. It's perfectly focused. But I want it to punch a little bit more. Now, if I punch the whole image with clarity, so let's go back to our background and let's use our clarity tool. We're already at 35. Let's pull it up. Ooh, this is okay, but it starts to look a little bit overdone. Let's go back to the original shot here. Very, very soft. So we like the fact that this is soft in the background. We like the fact that these water effects are soft here. But I don't like the fact that the ice has lost some of its structure, because this area here in this ice block with huge amounts of clarity looks fantastic. Without that clarity, it looks a bit washed out. So I want clarity in this ice block, but I don't want to affect the whole of the image. So we know how to do that. We use a mask. Let's leave a little bit of clarity on the background, maybe, I don't know, 15 or so. And then with our mask, I'm going to create a new empty layer called ice block, strangely. And in here, I'm going to draw now with not 100% fill. So we want this to be nice and soft. I want to make sure I've got a very soft brush, so no hardness. And I'm going to draw up and build up some layers. Let me just turn the mask on so you can see. So that's my first bit. That's going to be the heaviest in the background. In fact, I'm going to do this with, maybe we'll do it with opacity. But okay, so softer as I go out to the outside. But in the middle of this block, I really, really, really want to get 100% of the effect. Okay. If I turn on what's called the Grayscale Mask, so you hold down, instead of M for mask, you hold down Option and M, we can see by using flow, we've got this very, very harsh blob in the middle. So I'm actually going to undo a lot of that. And instead of using flow, we're going to use opacity, which is my favored version of doing this stuff. So with opacity, let's draw 25% in the middle. Cool. And we're going to go over it again, but we're going to make the blob a little bit bigger this time, and then a bit more in the middle. And then I'm going to go over the whole area again, but again make the blob even bigger this time. So what I'm doing is I'm feathering that mask. So effectively, the places that I only go over once are having a touch of an effect. The places like the middle that I've gone over many, many times now are getting it layered on and on and on, over and over again. And actually, I'm going to go even more extreme and pull out some of these lines here, these great water lines. I'm just going to pull that out there. Cool. So again, this is only at 25%. Some of these lines I'm going to pull in at a bit more, because we're going to add another layer of opacity on top. Okay, a bit like art. Okay, so there's my mask. Now, again, if I go back to that grayscale version of the mask, you can see what we've done here. And you can see it's a lot more subtle than by using flow. So personally, I tend to use opacity over flow. But what it means is I've feathered a mask in that's very, very dense in the middle of the ice block, softly fades out to the outside. I'm even going to go one further and put a really, really soft amount on the very outside, just so we don't get any halos. And again, what I've done is effectively done some art in the shapes around here, just because I want to enhance them quite a lot with clarity. So with this mask, I can now pull up clarity. And in fact, I can go to 100% on a block of ice quite easily. So if I go to before and after, before and after, what that's done is it hasn't affected anything else in the image. It's only affected this ice block. And if I turn this line or this mask or this layer, sorry, off, that's before, that's after. And look at what that's done to the actual ice itself. So I'm being a little bit unfair and going at 200%, but without, looks nice, but with, now it looks like a really sharp, cold, hard block of ice. One final thing with this shot. So I don't want to do a classic vignette. If I do a classic vignette, this is going to happen. So we're going to get some darkness in each of the corners and the light falls into the middle of the image. Well, as with most images, we're not composed to be in the middle of the image. We're composed to be on the third line. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new radial mask. And our radial mask is this one here. So we've got a linear gradient and we've got a radial gradient. This allows me to click and hold in the middle of the gradient that I want. I'm going to turn the mask on so you can see me drawing it. So click and hold. And I want this to be the focus. But what I don't want is this line around here to make it look like I'm creating a circle around the area that's most interesting. I want this feathering to be really, really soft. So to make the feathering soft, just like with a linear gradient, so you would change these three lines, the distances. Same with the radial gradient. Let's pull this distance in. And what that's doing is it's getting rid of the need for Capture One to create this halo and circle around the object, and instead having a really, really smooth fall off between no mask at all in the middle and 100% mask out the outside. I could even pull this bigger and make this even smaller here. And I could also, let's just pull that in there. I could, if I wanted to, squish it a little bit more into the shape of this ice block. Okay, let's turn that mask off. And with this mask, all I'm going to do is pull our exposure down there. I might choose, as I've pulled in the exposure, to pull up our saturation just a touch, just to keep this color really important up here. And overall, with the background, one final little thing, I'm going to pull our contrast up for the ice. Okay, I could pull our overall exposure up I'm just looking at this histogram up here. I could also do that with levels. So if we want to make our light areas really light, just like before, and our dark areas really dark, we start making it look a bit more like a fragment of ice. It looks cold, which is what we're going for. So let's create a clone of that and reset. So there's our raw. Nothing wrong with that exposure whatsoever. It looks pretty good. There's our finished image, which just feels a bit more dramatic. We've got this rush of water coming in. The focus is very clearly on this ice block, rather than potentially the focus falling accidentally out here into this color. Remember, when we're not in black and white, we see color as one of the differentiators for where our eye goes to first. So what we need to do is boost some of the contrast of this ice block, because the ice block is effectively the same level of color and luminosity as the rest of the water around it. So by using a mask over this ice block and the water around it, and by using a radial mask to pull in the focus into this layer here, and by then using a extreme amount of clarity, still set on natural, so it's still not going over the top into this ice block, what we've done is we've pulled the focus into it. With this same ice block mask, let's pull our structure up. I don't want to do too much. I'm showing you what can go wrong. So if we pull it up too much, you're going to get all these extra artifacts and all this noise and horrible haloing around the outside. But I could afford to pull it up maybe a couple of notches there, just to really make that ice block stand out. So before and after. And we go from there versus that, which was the raw file. Okay, cool. So there's our 4 edits for today. So 1 block of ice, 1 corrected field at sunset, 1 cave, which we can now see all the detail of, and 1 tree that looks rather magnificent in the mountains. Right, for those of you that are joining at the future ones on Friday, so our next session will be on Friday, so next session on Friday, 3rd of April at 1 PM in the UK. So that, just like today, that's going to be 8 AM New York and 8 PM in Hong Kong. On Friday, we are going to announce a competition where one of you can win a copy or a license of Capture One, Capture One Pro, and we'll give you all the details for that on Friday's session. In the meantime, if you want to send us images to edit, obviously remember that address, so poryforlive.wetransfer.com. Go to that page, upload your images in RAW file, please. JPEGs, we kind of struggle with editing, we're just limited in what we can do. So send me the RAW file, send me what's the issue, what you want to have a play with, or whether it's just can we just edit this up. We get that a day or 2 before, and then all of a sudden you appear with your image on the screen. As David Grover has just pointed out, that will be an amazing prize. Yes, it will be. But unfortunately, you have to be around next Friday to be able to work out how you can win it. So that gives us a few days to get some more images in. Please do keep sending them in, and I will catch you next week on the 3rd, or sorry, next week, in a few days on the 3rd, this Friday at 1 o'clock. Cheers, bye.